Hey everybody, so we are going to do another tutorial in After Effects this week. This week we are covering the parallax effect, which you can see in this reel that I just found on YouTube. It's not my work or anything, but I think it's a pretty good demo of what we'll be doing today. So the whole idea is that you take these still images, you cut layers out of these images, and then you put those into After Effects and move a camera through 3D space. And then you can add a little bit of motion in maybe your subject area using the puppet pin tool, which we haven't learned about just yet in the program. So this is an effect that you see very commonly in documentaries and maybe even YouTube like pseudo documentaries where you don't have actual footage to work with. All you have is a still image, so you can kind of animate those things so that they look a little bit more dynamic than maybe just like a push through space, like a scale up, or like a dissolve or a pan across the frame, which can work to kind of keep our interests in a certain place. But Parallax can also work to kind of draw your focus into a specific area of an image as well. We can do a whole lot of things. We've learned a bunch of stuff in After Effects, and all that stuff can be applied to a parallax. So to get working on this stuff, we need to download ourselves a high quality image. I'm going to pick a snake for whatever reason. I think nature images work really well with parallax. It's just my personal opinion. Sports images can work really well with the parallax effect as well. But I'm going to use a snake, and I want to point out something. It's really, really important that we have an image that's going to work well with the parallax effect before we get started on this stuff. So there's some things after doing this for a few years now that really stand out as like red flags as you're trying to find an image that's going to work for the project. So one of the things is like foliage, any kind of grass or leaves that you see. If you have to cut that into several layers, that's going to take a ton of time, right? So if you have a bunch of leaves on a tree, I'm looking for a snake that might be in a tree here to kind of point some stuff out to you. Most of these actually look okay, but let's find something maybe in a tree. So most of these snakes are on the ground actually, but I think the same thing goes with like blades of grass. So let's say we were trying to break this down into layers through space, through Z space, right? So if I talk about Z space, we're talking about like dimensions, right? So X and Y dimensions, X running horizontally, Y running vertically, and Z running like depth-wise through your image. And we've seen that already when we dealt with 3D text and stuff in After Effects, that you get that third dimension value that you can kind of manipulate, whether that's position or rotation. Okay, so if I was looking at this and I was trying to break this down into its different layers, and I had all these blades of grass, I would have to cut around all these little blades of grass, which this one might not be the worst thing in the world, but it would be a lot more trouble than it needs to be. Now, what we need to find with our image is a foreground element, a midground element, and a background element. We need all three of those things to really pull off a nice looking parallax. So if I was looking at something like, let's just look at this one here. So if I counted this black background as my background, and then my snake as the midground, I have no foreground element. So that whole like 3D dolly move that we're trying to create there probably isn't going to be very pronounced. We're not really going to be able to tell that it's like a dolly move instead of a zoom, which is what we really want to be able to see. And if I look at something like this, though, this could work. We have a potentially a foreground element in the snake's head and running back here, and then we have another piece of the snake that could be a little bit further back, and then we have some bricks or something like that. So you could have a foreground, a midground, and a background. Now, if we are looking for things that have those different elements, you have to look out for any of those planes that run from foreground to midground, or midground to background, or worse yet, foreground to midground to background. So if you find anything that has like the ground or a floor or ceiling that runs from this foreground, if we're looking at this Australia's 10 most dangerous snakes image, we have this foreground element that is the ground, and we could say maybe the snake is part of that foreground. But where do we differentiate between the foreground and midground? There's no clear line for that, right? We can't say, okay, it changes from foreground to midground from here to here. So if you see the ground in your image, it's probably not great. If you see just like one rock, like you're at the peak of a mountain or something like that, maybe that works. So a whole lot of like landscapes and stuff probably won't work very well for you. Like this, again, we have where is the foreground and midground? We can't really tell the difference between those things. There's no clear line for those things. So I'm going to find myself an image of a snake that has a foreground, midground, and background. You find an image of anything that you would like that contains that same kind of foreground, midground, and background. Okay, so what I've gone ahead and done is I saved my image of the snake and then just opened it up inside Photoshop here. Do keep in mind, I had some issues with it. If you save your image directly out of the Google image search, it might be like a thumbnail version or just a smaller sized version of it. It wasn't like a thumbnail for me, but it was not quite the same resolution as if you actually visited the website and downloaded the image that way. So here I have my snake. It's whatever resolution it is. And what I want to do is I want to cut out each of these layers that I defined and make them their own layers inside Photoshop. Now, the thing about that is with each layer, we want to see no elements of any other layer. So if I'm going to cut out the background, so I don't really need to cut out the background should take up the entirety of the frame, and I should see complete background here. I shouldn't see any portion of the snake at all, and I shouldn't have any holes in it either. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You can do that with whatever selection tools you like. And then we're going to use the content aware fill, as well as maybe the clone stamp tool, the patch tool, any of those tools that you want to use to fill in those gaps. So I'm going to do that, and I'm just going to time lapse you through it so you don't have to sit with me for several minutes while I cut all this stuff out. All right, so at this point, I have all of my stuff cut out independently. I haven't patched all of the other areas that have been kind of removed by separating all these things out into their own layers, though. So here's what I have. I have the original that I have at the lowermost layer. I just like to keep this on here just in case something gets messed up. I can always kind of refer back to the original, but we won't be using that for the actual the parallax effect or doing anything inside After Effects. So I can just shy that out. So we don't need it currently, but if something gets messed up, maybe we'll look at that later. I'm just going to shy out everything for you initially so you can kind of see these things one at a time. Here's your background layer. So this stuff was all background before. I used content aware fill to fill in the rest, and then I used the spot healing brush to clean up all of the edges there and stuff that had kind of a snake looking shape on it. I add in the background body, which looks fine in here, but there's this big gap that needs patched. before we move on to the next step. We have the midground body, which is exactly what I want. I will need to fill in a little bit of this area though, because all of these elements will be moving independently. If you imagined all of these things separating just a little bit, it's going to reveal that background layer if they do separate. So let's just to demonstrate, if these things move apart from each other, you can see right here we expose this big gap, and we would also be exposing a big gap around the head, which is my last layer here. So I want to make sure that I fill that stuff in so that when we dolly in, which doesn't just mean everything scales up, but things kind of separate as well, that I won't be revealing that background. But what you want to have at the end of the day is that you turn on all your layers and it should look like that original image. If you turn on one of the layers, you should see that thing that you had separated on its own without anything cutting through it. So if there was like a little snake tail that ran through his face here, I definitely need to patch that up. So I need to patch up my midground and my other body, my background body area, and then I'll be ready to move on to the next step. I might even want to add a little bit to the head, just give him a little bit more space down here by his neck. It's kind of hard to tell where the snake begins here, but we're going to assume that his neck comes right down here. Okay, so I'm going to do that, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so I've patched those areas up. It doesn't have to be perfect with those patches, you know, like if I look at just my midground alone, let me pull that up real quick for you. It gets pretty sketchy underneath the head, but all you need is just a little bit, unless you're going to do like a really, really dramatic parallax. And you can always adjust the camera movement based on how strong your patches actually are and how much is actually getting revealed. So I have all of my stuff taken care of inside Photoshop. Now I can actually move my PSD, my Photoshop document file, directly into After Effects to work with it. So another really cool synergy between a couple of programs in the Creative Cloud. So we're going to go ahead and save this real quick. So we want to make sure that we save this as a PSD and not a JPEG. If we save it as a JPEG, all of those layers are going to get kind of smashed together, burned in, so that we can't separate those after the fact. We're going to go ahead and save this someplace where we can find it and name it something that makes sense. So I'm just going to name this Snake PSD and save it on my desktop so I can find that quickly. I'm going to maximize compatibility. This should automatically be selected on for you and stuff. I don't think it would hurt if you don't have that on just for this application, but if you ever wanted to open it in something else that can open up PSDs and stuff, make sure that you have that selected on. Now we're going to go ahead and import that into an After Effects project. So I just have an untitled project temporarily. I'll save that as something when we get there. And I'm going to import that PSD. So it's snake.psd. Here it is. And I'm going to import that. Okay, and I'm going to tell it that this is not footage, so it wants to import it as footage. That's going to mash all those layers together, like I mentioned with the JPEG. But instead, what we want to do is import composition, and either of these retain layer sizes or composition is going to be fine for me. I'm just going to retain layer sizes just because I want to be safe about things, and maybe I'm a little bit superstitious about that. So composition, retain layer sizes, and then we want them to be editable layer styles. So we don't want to merge anything into footage. We just want to bring in our PSD, and now it's a composition. And if we double click that composition, we can see all of our layers are now layers in this composition. So at this point, we can animate these things all separately. If I wanted to adjust the position of the head, I could do that. Now you see if I go too far off of here, we're going to see some serious issues. But we could animate all of these things as their own as their own layers in this project. Instead, what I want to do is I want to turn all of these layers into 3D elements and then move a camera through 3D space at them. That'll give us that dolly effect. Our animated camera, or our camera that we create, moves through Z space just like a camera would with a dolly in. Now you can also do this as a dolly left or right, or a dolly out. Either of those will work. The left and right is much more likely to reveal some stuff underneath there, that patchwork that you've done. The dolly in and the dolly out are both perfectly good options, and you can do either or. It's the same process. It's just that you would invert the keyframes that I'm doing. You can just set those up yourself that way. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn all of these layers into 3D layers. I'm just going to turn on that little cube icon next to the layers. Our original, remember, we're not even messing with that. It's just going to be shied out. It's there if we need it as a reference. Okay, all of these are 3D layers now, and mine didn't mess up, but yours might. As soon as you toggle all these things on, you might notice that your background, like your layers, might look all out of mesh, and some layers might be like kind of bleeding into other ones, or your background might cover up your foreground element. That's completely normal. The thing is, once you turn these things into 3D layers, then you are they're all positioned in the same exact place. So imagine all these things are flat pieces of paper, and they all exist right on top of each other. The computer can't tell you exactly where or what you should be seeing from the camera's view until you move them in 3D space, which is what we're going to do right now. So we're just going to turn on position for each of the layers. We're going to work one at a time. We're going to adjust their Z space value. So I'm going to bring the snake head in closer to us. That's not scaling it up. Remember, it's moved closer in Z space. It appears as though it's being scaled up, but it's just getting closer to the camera. Okay, so my mid-ground, I can go either way. In my case, I'm just going to leave it alone, and I'm going to mess with the background body and send that, I'm going to click P for position, and send that in the opposite direction. So it's getting further away from us. And then my actual background here one more time, and I'm going to send that really far back there. And it's a little bit hard to see because the snake head is kind of covering things up, and now we have this kind of surreal looking image of the snake. But we're going to clean all this stuff up by just using our scale values for each of those elements. So if I go back to the head and I go to scale, I can scale it down and then kind of reposition it back where it was. And here's where that here's where the reference photo can really come in handy for us. If I just want to bring that to my uppermost layer now, I can just toggle that off and on to see how big that snake head should be. So the head is a little bit too big still, so I'll scale that down a little bit more and put it in position. I can pop that off and on, and it doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of approximate here. That's pretty close. We'll call it pretty close, so we can keep things moving. So same with the background. I'm going to press S on my keyboard for scale that back up until it fills out the entirety of the frame. That looks pretty good to me. And then finally the background body, I'm going to press S on my keyboard for scale that back up and move it to where it needs to be. And I'm thinking that's about right, but I'm going to go ahead and toggle off and on the original. And it does look like it's way too big, so I was a little bit off on that. So we'll scale it back down and we'll move it over. And it needs to come up still. Okay, and that's approximately it. I could refine this a little bit further and get it closer still, but it looks natural to me, and it's pretty darn close to our original image. Now, the more we make these values, that Z space, like if we pushed our background further back and scaled it further up, the more pronounced our movement is going to be. So that's something to keep in mind as you work. If you make this camera move and it doesn't seem like you're getting the parallax effect that you want, if you want it to be more pronounced, if you want it to look unnatural, then you might want to make that the difference between where things are in Z space more dramatic. So now I am going to add a camera here. So if I right click in my layer panel area and go to new and then camera, I'll have a few options. I'm just going to set my focal length to 50 millimeters here. The camera should look exactly like it did before. Like nothing's really changed as soon as I create my camera. If yours changes in terms of position for your layers, that might mean that you have a higher or a wider lens on your camera. It could also mean that you just have a really dramatic amount of difference between your layers in terms of Z-space position, and it could also mean that you're just working with a very different resolution image than me. So there is a little bit of a difference between things. If your camera does create some kind of issues for you, you can always just then like reposition your layers and rescale your layers to make it work. All right, so I've created my camera here, and now to make the parallax effect work, I'm just going to click P for position on my camera. I'm going to create a keyframe. So at this point, everything looks good. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to make my parallax last about 4 seconds. Yours can be longer or shorter depending on what kind of action you have going on there and stuff, or how far you want your camera to move. And then I'm just going to move my Z space position on my camera, and you can see what's happening already. You can see that if I go a little bit too far, then my snake head goes crazy because I may have put a little bit too much, I may have moved that head a little bit too close to the camera when I was messing with my my position on the head layer. So if I zoom in there, everything else looks good. The head just looks a little bit off. So I'm just going to go ahead and fix that up real quick. So I'm just going to jump back to my head position, and I'm going to move that back. Okay, and then I'm going to, I can scale it, but it actually doesn't look too bad here. Let's see what it looks like at the beginning. Yeah, I do need to scale that up a little bit. Okay, and I'll reposition it. So no keyframes on the head at all. I just altered the value there. So if I play that back, I should get a nice parallax effect. Yeah, the head's really coming at me there, so I think I still need to adjust that a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick for you. All right, much better. So now we can see that head and body kind of come at you in a way that isn't messing with the background. So if you've ever looked at like a dolly versus a zoom, you know that the background doesn't change very much. We don't have a compression of space like we would with a zoom lens. So you should see that kind of dolly effect happening right here. Now I'm going to fix this up a little bit with some eases. I'm going to ease in at the end and ease out at the beginning. So all we've animated is the camera movement. And I'm just going to trim up my workspace as well. I'll give that a couple of watches. All right, yeah, we could go back to our Photoshop document and maybe extend that neck down a little bit more on the head. And what's really cool about the synergy between After Effects and Photoshop is if I do go back to this and I want to extend out that neck, so let me just do that real quick. All right, so I haven't really done too much there, but I did extend the neck a little bit. It is a little bit funky from the clone stamp, but it looks close enough to me. So if I go ahead and save this thing really quickly with my adjustment, and I hop back over into After Effects, you'll see that that has automatically updated for me as soon as I hopped back into the program. Okay, so now if I play that back, I can see I got a little bit more neck to my snake there, and I'm covering up that bit of ugly area. All right, so my camera movement looks good, but how about that little bit of extra animation to our image? So if I want my snake to look like he's actually doing something, so the idea here is like this is like super slow motion or something, right? If I wanted to make this look like slow motion, make the snake moving, so it's not just that we have the camera movement, we can do that with the this little tool up here. It looks like a push pin, and you can see if you hover over it, it says puppet position pin tool. If you click and hold that, you'll find a bunch of different puppet options. And the idea is that if you put some pinpoints on any given layer, you can stretch the space between those pinpoints. So I can stretch this stuff out and kind of morph my image however I see fit. So it's kind of, I guess, somewhat similar to the liquefy tool in Photoshop. So if I click and hold, I can see all these different tools in here, or tools that belong to the same family. And if you click on like this puppet bend pin tool and click that, you'll see that it's a slightly different looking puppet pin that you've created, and then there's like this extra little circle around it, and it looks like there's a little node that you can drag, which you can, and that sort of bloats your image. So it might need a couple on here so you can really see what's going on, but it can bloat a particular area of your subject or whichever layer you're on. So if that makes sense for your project, you can do that. So maybe one more little tool in that family that you can use is the starch pins. So if I put a couple of these pinpoints and they show up as red on here, you won't be able to deform your image around those. And then if you do have those regular points on there, you'll see that, oops, I need two of them. You'll see as you deform those things, the space between those two starch pinpoints stay the same. So you can create some rigid areas. So let's say maybe you have a human being's arm. You don't want their arm to turn all like jello-y and stuff. You want like arm bones in there. You would actually put those two red spots. So all I'm going to do is just work with the regular position tool. Maybe, you know what, I'll go ahead and use the starch tools too, and I'll just put a couple of those at the bottom of the neck here, so it's not going to move around on me too much. And I might put one a little bit further up too. So this whole area here that is like kind of a problem area in my image. So if that area did move when I was manipulating the rest of the head, it would probably expose a part of my image that I don't want exposed. I'll just keep those starch points there to kind of keep things in place a little bit at least. It does have the ability to move, but the neck won't get deformed with the rest of the head. And then from there, I'm going to put a couple of pin points in. And what I would recommend is put them on points where your subject might pivot. So at this I have one like at the jawline, at the back of the head, and then at the nose. And everything's going to look normal because I haven't adjusted these things. But I'll jump to the end of my animation now, and then I'll make an adjustment to these pinpoints. And over that period of time, we'll see the movement take place. So it creates keyframes for those pinpoints. Now you can see like, oh, now my snake is kind of pointing his nose up in the air over the course of the animation. And that actually could be good enough for me. If your animation or if your subject is much more complicated than this, if you have a human, you might have arms moving or hands moving, or just a little bit of movement goes a long way. So you might have several elements that need moved, but don't move them too much, because remember, we're trying to make it like as though we're in slow motion here. So that's the idea. This is the final result for me. I'm going to do one more thing though, to make this look just a little bit nicer. And that is I'm going to add a grain layer. I could, add one of my really nice grain layers that I have downloaded and stuff. If you happen to have one in a collection, certainly add that. Add it as an overlay or a soft light, and that's going to kind of hide any slight imperfections right around the edges of your layers. And it's a good thing to maybe consider adding even to like some text effects and stuff to kind of flatten your image out and make it all look like one piece. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick, but I'm going to generate it inside After Effects. This is not the ideal way to work, but considering that I can't give you a whole lot of files with our circumstances, we're going to make it work today. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new solid. And we're just going to make it a black solid that matches the same width and height. It should automatically do that for you, but do check on that and make sure that it works for you. And I'm going to call this grain. Okay, and it fills out my frame perfectly, and I'm going to put that at the uppermost layer. From there, I'm going to search in my effects and presets for grain, and we'll see a few options here. Match grain is actually really helpful when we do compositing in here. You can match an area of grain from a video and add it to a different layer that you're adding. So again, if you have like some text and you're trying to match the grain that was in an original video that is over, like the text is overlaid on top of a video, and you want to take the grain from the video and add it to the text, you can use that match grain effect. It's pretty helpful in that way. In this case, we don't have any moving grain because it was all still images. We're just going to click add grain, drag and drop that onto our grain layer. Okay, from here we're going to head on over to our effect controls, and then under add grain we have a bunch of options. For whatever reason, preview was my first option here. I'm going to make sure that that's as final output so I can see that my grain is being added to the entirety of my layer. And then I can make some adjustments just based on taste here, intensity and size and softness of our grain. Make sure that you do jump into like a full screen mode for a moment and zoom in to make sure that at 100% your grain looks okay. I'm going to jump back out. So I'm at 100% now, but I can't see my entire image. My grain size looks pretty big to me, so I'm going to turn that down, and that's much better. And intensity, that looks okay maybe for now, but what I really want to do, because it has a kind of wild rainbow look to it, I'm going to just change that. If I hop on over to the color area of our add grain effect, just turn that on to monochrome. Now we have like this black and white grain. So that looks okay to me. I'm going to go ahead and see what it looks like real quick, and then I can make adjustments from there. So head back on over to our layers panel, our layer that says grain. We have blending modes. If you don't have those available, remember right down here you have the transfer controls pane. That's what you need to get to your blending modes, and we're going to try overlay and soft light. In this case, the soft light is certainly better than overlay, and even then it's a little bit harsh, so I'm going to pop on opacity and turn that down a little bit, so I can still see that I have some grain there, but it's not really messing with our image too much. If I play that back, it's got a little bit of grain to it, and it looks like video. And there we have it, a 2.5D parallax Ken Burns effect on a snake, or whatever you've decided to choose. Okay, so we are going to export this thing. We're going to put that up on Canvas as always. Something that you should think about, you should start thinking about your final project. We still have a few weeks, but at this point you have almost everything that you need to know to work within After Effects. So we still have a few more things to learn in the program. We're going to do particle effects, and we're going to do some rotoscoping, which is something that a whole lot of people don't like very much, but we'll do both of those things still. So we have a few weeks of tutorials still to go, but you should kind of think about what can I use in After Effects and how can I apply it to projects that will actually benefit me. So it has to be of an appropriate level of difficulty, and you have to pitch these projects. We'll just open up a Canvas discussion. So if you're not really sure what you want to do yet and you want to have a discussion about what you can and can't do, the guidelines are fairly vague. So it really just depends on what you want to do. If you want to do another parallax effect, I'm totally down for that, so long as it's difficult enough for a final project. So you can't just do the same thing that we did. You'll have to do a very complex parallax, or you would need to do a series of parallaxes. You could potentially do like a title sequence. So you're using the 3D text or the various text effects that we did, but you're doing a much more complicated project out of those things. Hopefully that makes sense to you. If not, we can certainly have a conversation about it in Canvas discussions, and we can kind of work things out until you find a project that works for you. All right, so that's it for this week. Upload your parallax effect. I look forward to seeing how yours turned out. Hopefully you didn't run into any of those pitfalls that we mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial. It's a really kind of cool effect, and maybe something that you could even post on your Instagram or Facebook feeds or whatever you kids do these days. All right, that's it for this week. I will see you all in 1 week with more After Effects.